I'll just offer a few introductory remarks because I am seeking your help in a constructive way on this paper. It should have been more clear in the draft. This really is a very first draft. Nobody else has seen this. I myself have not read it, and so it'll be great to hear your reactions. Now, some of these points generalize the observations I make and are not at all special to originalism or constitutional interpretation. They generalize to decision-making more broadly, and I really am interested in that. But there definitely is an overlap with with a set of inquiries into how to operationalize interpretation of the Constitution or constitutional decision-making, and then in particular, originalism, especially with work in the construction zone, at least understood in a certain way. Okay, so what I'm interested in doing in the paper is to try to explore options and to identify trade-offs and look for patterns out there in the so-called wild, and then to try to think through some explanations, possible explanations for those patterns. Now, sometimes those explanations will connect up with the trade-offs that I'm suggesting, but often that won't be so true, and that makes the trade-off observations a kind of separable proto-normative analysis, whereas much of the paper is much more about description and positive theorizing. Well, what's going on here? And a lot of the material I'm using, you saw, is from state courts as opposed to federal courts, where we can see some additional variation. So there is a normative aspect, I suppose, to the paper and the project, but in some ways that's less important to me than just trying to understand better the patterns that are out there and thinking about why they might exist, and in particular why in federal constitutional litigation that might be a space of maybe extra wildness or maybe a kind of division that's yielding a more or less intentional lack of clarity in how sources are supposed to fit together. Okay, so let me say a few words based on a couple of slides on range, relationships, and trade-offs. Okay, so one kind of discussion, if not debate, that we have is about the appropriate range of considerations or sources or analytic tools to try to make a decision, including a decision on a proposition of constitutional law or who ought to prevail in a particular case where the Constitution or constitutional law is at issue. So that range question is persistent. It won't go away. It's still interesting. And at the same time, we also have to think about the appropriate relationship among those sources. I'll just use that as a shorthand. Those sources, what's the appropriate relationship among them? Are they supposed to be interacted in some way so that we learn more about one from what we learn about another? Should they be added up on some same metric of value? Is there a hierarchy that ought to be imposed so that some considerations are considered only on some condition? One popular condition is some sense of clarity or lack of ambiguity in a top-tier set of sources. And if there is going to be a hierarchy, then what's going to go where? How do you choose? What should be top-tier considerations and lower-tier considerations? And then what are the implications of having that structure, that analytic or logical structure? And then in addition, how's that actually going to play out when human beings, alone or in groups, try to execute that protocol? And on that point, I won't have much to say in this particular paper, but I can tell you I've been working on statutes, statutory interpretation, statutory cases for a number of years. And there I've been trying to use a number of empirical methods to get a better handle on how people actually think through decisions when we have these different possibilities on the table. Okay, so just a few more minutes, I promise. This is to scope out graphically the choices so I can articulate some trade-offs. So I'm combining a bit the choice of range here and relationship, because one kind of choice is just number of sources or analytic tools. How much should we take on board? What should we consider valid? And then some stuff might be valid or arguably relevant, but maybe we should just leave it out for one or more reasons. So on the left side, that kind of model I'll just call inclusive mix. So take all the relevant and valid sources for some proposition of law or who ought to win some contest and mix them all together somehow. One way to think about that is granting these different sources weights and just summing it up. Then on the right side there, that's an exclusive mix, same sort of idea. Somehow these different sources are going to have to be aggregated or combined somehow, but just fewer of them. And then in the middle, I have what seems to me to be the prevailing officially endorsed view at the state level for many areas of law, including constitutional law, state constitutional law, and also for a number of areas in federal law, like federal statutes. This is the prevailing idea, is to have a hierarchy, a tie-breaking hierarchy set up. But that seems not to be the case, at least not generally speaking, for federal constitutional law. Okay, so in any event, it's fairly typical to set up a decision-making structure, a logical structure like this in the middle with hierarchies. And then one way of trying to figure out or begin to figure out when to use only top-tier sources and when to drop down to tier 2 is this catchy little phrase, if clear, stop here. And then there are lots of criticisms of that kind of logical hinge, I call it. So now we have the Supreme Court Justice has been an explicit critic of that kind of logical hinge for these kinds of analytic structures. That's Brett Kavanaugh, who on the statutory side repeated a lot of concerns that people have raised about having a clarity test, which is related to plain meaning tests. Okay, so then in any event, there could be tier 2 sources. We'd have to decide what's going to go there. I have some suggestions about what will make good lower tier sources, especially if you're interested in decisiveness. So one would be, well, do those sources tend to point in just one direction? Or are they themselves likely to be contested? Some other ideas about building out tier 2 sources. One would be as if they're especially costly in terms of decision costs to use. Then it might be a good idea to withhold use just as a last resort to save on those decision costs. Another idea, not sure this is really the right label, maybe it seems a little offensive, but the idea that they're shoddy, that in some normative sense it's problematic to rely on them, but not so problematic that you want to exclude them altogether. And that's part of the trick with this nonetheless very common architecture, this logical structure, which is you have to have reasons to include these lower tier sources, but not such good reasons to demote them that you shouldn't be considering them altogether. That's a real trick. Under certain decision conditions and certain decision environments, I do think it's justifiable, but I think probably less often than is reflected in our current law and practices. It's pretty easy to trash sources. It's pretty hard to trash them, but not so much that you should think, yeah, I'll just consider them on condition. And you always have the option, at least theoretically, of just giving those sources just less weight. So you need some kind of extra reason to think we should have this little bit more complicated structure. Okay, so just a minute or two more here. I can just suggest a few big questions and trade-offs. So one problem really for all of us is deciding how to decide on which of these architectures to choose, which of these structures to choose. That itself raises another question of range. What's the appropriate range of considerations? And then, once again, what's the appropriate relationship among those considerations? That's not obvious. So all of this is a choice set, and then it's subject to some debate about how to make a choice appropriately across these different possibilities. I can tell you a little bit about trade-offs if this is not really a restrained choice, if you can open your mind to a bunch of different considerations. Then, more or less, this middle choice, which is relatively popular, even if not in federal constitutional law, it'll probably reflect middling decision costs, not super high and not super low. Probably a middling level of decision quality, because every once in a while sources will be thrown out that would be useful and valuable in elaborating law. And at the same time, at least on a certain set of assumptions that I've built out, it's likely to be the most decisive of all three. So if you worry about indeterminacy, you might want to sacrifice some for this hierarchical structure in order to generate more decisiveness in decision making. And then that leads to a big question, though, is whatever the formal or official prescriptions and endorsements, how are human beings actually going to behave when you give them instructions like this? So just real quickly to illustrate, depending on what you put in source 2, that can motivate or instigate motivated cognition or not. So if you know for sure that in that second tier, there's going to be either like a statist or a classical liberal outcome, then you might not worry too much about uncertainty or lack of clarity in the top tier sources, knowing if that happens, you do get that outcome. It's fairly sure at that second stage. But other kinds of source categories or sources won't have those features and might not instigate the kind of motivated reasoning that could be of concern. All right, so that's enough on the large picture here. I can say lots more about constitutional law and federal constitutional law in particular. I do hope at a minimum, though, we can foreground and think better about what the trade-offs are when we build out these structures, because I highly doubt that many of the judges who are endorsing one or another have really thought through real well about what the consequences are likely to be. Thanks a lot for your patience, and thanks, John, for taking a look at the paper.